Tibet's spiritual leader says the role he embodies will continue after his death, saying the next Dalai Lama will be chosen in line with tradition. But China insists that it should have the final say. So, could this become a potential flashpoint in relations between Beijing and India, which is home to a large exiled Tibetan community? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finighan. The Dalai Lama has announced that there will be another spiritual leader to Tibetan Buddhists. As the Nobel Peace Prize laureate approaches the age of 90, attention has turned to the sensitive issue of his successor. Each Dalai Lama is considered a living Buddha. The current one fled to India in 1959 after a failed uprising against Chinese communists in Tibet, and says his next reincarnation could be born among his followers there. But Beijing, which considers the Dalai Lama a separatist, insists that it has a veto over the choice, while the US supports the Dalai Lama's right to determine his own reincarnation. So, how will the selection process balance religion, regional politics and sovereignty? And if it fails, what's the likelihood of two Dalai Lamas? We'll put that to our guests in just a moment. But first, a report from Kulsum Sharif.
I am affirming that the institution of the Dalai Lama will continue.
Exiled Tibetan spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, confirming that he will have a successor as he turns 90 this week. It ends years of speculation after he had indicated that he might be the last person to hold the centuries-old role. His followers, most of whom live in exile along with him in the northern Indian town of Dharamshala, are relieved.
I am extremely happy, not only for us Tibetans, but for the whole world. He is a teacher. He is so giving. He gives to everyone, the entire world. His love is for everyone.
I feel his institute of Dalai Lama is continuous, of course. It's very, very important. So not even for the Tibetan people, it's important for this Mother Earth. He comes in a free country and he continues his 14 Dalai Lama's job left. He can continue what this is.
According to Tibetan tradition, the Dalai Lamas are reincarnated after they die. The current leader says a foundation set up by him will recognize a successor after his death. But that plan may face some challenges. China insists it should have the final say on who becomes the spiritual leader and says it should be someone from the Chinese-controlled Tibetan area. While a majority of the 14 Dalai Lamas so far have come from Tibet, a former Tibetan Prime Minister in exile says the spiritual figure could be chosen from outside the region and can be a woman.
There is no traditional kind of restriction. Dalai Lama should be born in Tibet. Dalai Lama born in Mongolia, the third one, and Dalai Lama born today in India, the sixth Dalai Lama, and there's no nationality or geographical boundary.
Tenzin Gyatso became the 14th reincarnation of the Dalai Lama in 1940. He fled Tibet in 1959 after a failed uprising against Chinese rule. The Nobel Peace Laureate has helped establish a democratic government in exile for 100,000 Tibetans living in India. The Dalai Lama's succession plan is likely to be a flashpoint for China, which views him as a separatist with no right to represent Tibetans. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
So let's bring in our guests. From London, we're joined by Robbie Barnett, a writer and researcher on modern Tibetan-Chinese history and politics, and a professor at SOAS University of London. From Beijing, we're joined by Andy Mock, a geopolitical analyst and senior research fellow at the Centre for China and Globalization. And also in London, Dibyesh Anand, who is a political analyst and professor of international relations at the University of Westminster. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Robbie, let's start with you. Given that the Dalai Lama has, a following at most of a few million people, mostly living on a remote plateau or in exile, and that he's a globally recognized figure of peace and compassion. Why is he, and the issue of his successor, such a thorny and controversial issue for China?
Well, it seems to be that China and Chinese leaders, even from the time of Mao in the early 50s, have always had this presumption that you can't rule Tibetans, you can't control Tibetans, and you can't persuade Tibetans to accept your rule unless you have a religious leader that they respect who will tell them to do that. So this is part of a somewhat traditional, old-school Leninist idea about one people ruling another people. You need an intermediary. You need a figurehead who the local people will respect and who will persuade them to accept the new rulers. And the Chinese are very clear that they seem to need a Dalai Lama to play that role. They want to have a tame Dalai Lama who will tell Tibetans, you are part of China, Tibet has always been part of China, and so on. So this seems to be the core issue here.
Andy, would you agree with that? Why does China insist on having its say in the Dalai Lama's succession?
Well, I would add a little bit to what we just heard. I think that is largely correct, but a little bit incomplete because it only begins the explanation with the founding of the People's Republic of China. But we have to look really from a broader scope of Chinese history. So for China, the Dalai Lama is not just a religious leader. He is part of an institution whose legitimacy actually has rested with the central government of China, not since 1949, but since 1793. So a little bit after the founding of the United States in 1776. Quite a long time, when the Qing dynasty at the time introduced this lottery to exactly address some of these problems of how to choose the leader, the religious leader, in terms of not allowing outside manipulation of this process by this so-called golden urn, where candidates were put in and the next Dalai Lama was drawn out. So when we hear this talk by the current Dalai Lama of relying on tradition, I think the real tradition is actually the one that is used in China.
Dibyesh, I'll come to you in just a moment, but let me just give Robbie a chance to come back on that.
Oh, well, this is a very fascinating debate over whether religions are a legal system that is run by laws and whether becoming a religious leader is like getting a driving license or a medical certificate. You have to have a legal system from the state to tell you what to do to make that possible, or whether religions are, in many cases, customs, conventions that are really moderated constantly over time by the religious leaders and the religious community. And so what we see here is what Andy's explaining actually very well, is the Chinese state view of religion as a kind of legally based institution. And what we're seeing from maybe many Tibetan Buddhists, not just the Dalai Lama, is this much, shall we say, much older sense of religion as a set of conventions that is gradually evolving within the community and among its leaders. And so that's partly the intellectual debate here.
Dibyesh, is there not, as the times of I'll get back to you in a moment, Robbie, but Dibyesh, let's bring you in here. Is there not, as the Times of London put it, something rather absurd about the Chinese Communist Party, an atheist organisation, feeling that it somehow has the right to pronounce on who's been reincarnated as whom?
It is. Again, thank you for having us here. It is absurd. And I'll give two examples. Of course, you have got Chinese Communist Party, and we can say that, of course, as one of the speakers pointed out, that there's a longer tradition of using golden urn system through which the center decided who the Dalai Lama or the Panchen Lama, another senior Lama, would be. What he ignored, and when he pointed out that 1793, when the United States was barely formed, let's remind ourselves, Dalai Lama's institution is longer than People's Republic of China, and Qing Empire combined. So there was also a very prominent fifth Dalai Lama who was much before 1793. Therefore, the institution has been much longer than what Beijing claims, number one. Number two, you also find that today, when China claims that it will govern the reincarnation process through what it calls Order number 5 of 2007 State Religious Bureau Affairs, they say that basically the China Buddhist Association will make an appeal in this case to Beijing of who the next reincarnation should be. What it conveniently ignores is China Buddhist Association is not an independent organization. It's not a semi-independent organization. It's essentially a wing of United Front Work Department. What is the United Front Department? It's a part of Communist Party of China. Therefore, actually, there's an absolute control over the process in terms of the claim by the Communist Party. And that is where the absurdity lies. Therefore, it is not about tradition of golden urn. And one final thing, remember, the old golden urn system, which Andy pointed out, was during Qing Empire. Qings were not Han Chinese. Qing were Manchus who were Tibetan Buddhists. So we are talking of an era in history where the emperors were also Tibetan Buddhists and respected. Today, if Xi Jinping becomes Tibetan Buddhist, maybe Communist Party leaders become Tibetan Buddhists, maybe they'll have some claim to legitimacy. Without that, while it is a Communist Party, it doesn't have any legitimacy of the process.
All right. Let's give Andy a right of reply on that. Andy?
Sure. No, I think these are interesting claims being put forth, but I think they're not very grounded in reality or, frankly, even logic. So first, let me address this question of politics and religion. So I think there's a long history of the intersection of politics and religion. We could look to Europe as a great example of this with the Catholic Church, which at one point was the largest landowner in Europe and dominated people's lives, not just in spiritual matters, but in very tangible physical ways, from cradle to death. And, one of the big transitions we've seen in Europe is really I guess we could think of it as striking the balance between politics and religion. And, I think to say that the Communist Party is atheist is not wrong, but I think it misses the larger, more important point that doesn't this show the inclusiveness of the current government of China, which of course is led by the Communist Party of China, in that while party members do not have specific religious beliefs, they encourage and provide space for not just Buddhists, but Christians, Jews as well, and to have a properly functioning state. Clearly, the government needs to be involved. And I think if we look at any country in the world, the government is involved to some degree in overseeing religious activity. The other quick point I would make, too, is we need to also look at tangible measures of life expectancy, per capita GDP, literacy rates, et cetera, in Tibet since 49. And I think, we really can't dispute the enormous progress that has been made. Now, of course, some people will say, there's been some loss of cultural traditions, which, again, is not untrue, but I think this is the larger point.
Okay, Robbie, what do you make of what you've just heard, and why are there such big geopolitical dimensions to the Dalai Lama's succession, not just religious ones? How does this draw in India, where of course many Tibetans live in exile, but also the US?
Well, I think you're right to draw us to that larger perspective, that larger context. And here we can be quite useful, us academics, because we can point to some very clear kind of concrete realities that help explain why an issue like this that seems to us culturally obscure and esoteric and so on, why it actually has political significance, geopolitical significance. And one simple point about that is Tibet is a plateau, or the larger Tibetan area. It's very, very high. It's very, very important geographically. Most of China's water, about 80%, comes from the plateau. A lot of the water supplies, the major rivers of Southeast Asia, come from the Tibetan plateau. And it's also militarily important, obviously, because it's high up. It overlooks India, Central Asia, and so on. And we can make that more vivid by reminding ourselves that the Tibetan plateau, the larger Tibetan inhabited area as it was, is about 1/4 of China's territory. So it's really a very significant amount, a small population, 7 million or so Tibetans, you could say, but a very significant part of China. And then we have another factor, which is in a way historical, which is China has always historically, over many hundreds of years, found these western areas of China, the highlands of Tibet or Mongolia, the grasslands, Xinjiang and so on, to be strategically threatening. You know, invading armies came from those areas in the past, Manchus and so on, as Dibesh mentioned. So there's a lot of strategic importance for China. It tends to downplay that by talking about these as minority areas, but actually they may call them minorities, but they're very significant strategically. And then we have to look at what is the neighborhood. The neighborhood might, primarily in this case, India, also Nepal, Bhutan, and so on. These are pivotal points for China because it's those borders, China and India and Bhutan, where the borders have not been settled and where there is still real military tension, at least with India, for China.
Dibesh, how does India feel about the Tibetans who live in exile there? Are they an asset as far as India is concerned or a hindrance, certainly as far as its relations with China are concerned?
Okay, can I just add to previous speakers what they said, and then I'll back to India, right? One, of course, we are talking of very complex matter. That's as simple as that. We have to remember a few things. One, every colonial power, every colonizing power has always claimed that they have liberated people and they're doing something good for the people. Therefore, the fact that, let's say, the life in Tibet is much better in modern terms than what it was in old Tibet is neither here nor there. And this is very much part and parcel of Chinese official propaganda, where they claim that Tibet has always been part of China for 5,000 years approximately. They will insist that Dalai Lama has to accept that not only Tibet's future lies with China, but Tibet's history was with China. Second, they will claim that old Tibet, traditional Tibet was somehow awful, and the new Tibet is all land of milk and honey kind of approach. But we should not go into that. We should simply focus on one single fact here. Here's a religious leader, and the process is very simple. 15th Dalai Lama, the next Dalai Lama will be a continuation of 14th Dalai Lama. He has to carry on work. From Beijing's perspective, if the 14th Dalai Lama is a separatist, a splittist, and then it somehow claims that even while the 14th Dalai Lama has made it very clear he will not reincarnate inside Chinese-controlled Tibet, what power and authority does Beijing have to somehow transform his manifestation once the 14th Dalai Lama is gone and a new boy or girl or someone is found later? So we have to understand there is a problem of logic, there's a problem of absurdity. But coming back to India, of course, India is also a complicated nation, like China is a complicated nation. In Indian context, there are some who see Tibet or Tibetan movement as an asset. Some still see it as a liability, and many recognize increasingly that the Dalai Lama and Tibetans have played a very crucial role in stabilizing the border region with China to an extent, because there's a dispute between India and China over the border, because the border that is today was actually British India-Tibet border, which became India-China border, right? So they acknowledge that. They also acknowledge that Dalai Lama often speaks very highly of India. He often calls him the son of India. So even in terms of public diplomacy, the Dalai Lama has played a crucial role for India. But strategically, and we have to remember, only a few hours ago, the Minority Minister of India, Kiren Rijiju, made it very clear. He made a statement that the Dalai Lama's institution is for the Dalai Lama to decide and no one else can interfere. That's the strongest statement that has come out of India, where they have made it very clear that it is for the Dalai Lama to decide. Okay. And in that sense, we have to recognize what the US and India do is they put back the sovereign decision of the Dalai Lama's future with the Dalai Lama.
Let's put the same question then to Andy. How does China feel about the Dalai Lama's presence in India? How has that affected, from China's perspective, its relations with India?
Well, here I would say, there is a geopolitical aspect to this, which the professor also touched on. The Tibetan highlands are the source of some of the most important rivers in the world. It is a buffer zone for China. So this is, from a strategic geopolitical perspective, it's a non-negotiable. And then we need to look at a little bit of modern history here, because since the 1950s, and this is in declassification declassified U.S. files. This is not quote unquote Chinese propaganda, but that the CIA trained and funded an armed insurgency in Tibet that ran for decades until 1974, and even provided a stipend for the Dalai Lama. Now, why do I say this? Because this is important to know, because we can also consider this one of the most effective psyops, psychological operations in modern history, a very successful propaganda campaign, because it is in the US's strategic interest to undermine and weaken those that it sees as potential threats, whether this is the former Soviet Union, whether this is China, whether this is Iran. And what we've seen is, from providing bullets and other material, it's shifted to this more intangible approach. So I think from China's perspective, the Dalai Lama is an important religious leader, that this is an important part of the Chinese multi-ethnic family, and that this process needs to be allowed to happen without foreign interference. So, and I think I think this was in L.A. Confidential, right? There was a line that the devil's most impressive feat was persuading the world that he doesn't exist. And I think, this idea that China is engaging in politics here is when it's in fact the exact opposite.
Well, I see Robbie smiling as you're speaking there. Robbie, please feel free to react to that. But we're running out of time, so I want to ask you a question as well. Could you foresee a situation in which we could end up with two rival Dalai Lamas jostling for legitimacy? An exiled leader appointed by the Lamas faithful to the incumbent, and one approved or appointed by the Chinese government?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. You're putting your finger on what is the likely scenario moving ahead after the death of the Dalai Lama. In fact, I have been told by my sources that the party in Tibet has already set up what it calls a preparatory committee for the search for the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. And that committee, something really that Divyesh touched on, will be run by the party. And we know that because that's how they ran the search for the previous Lama that was very important in 1995. And so we are looking at a very likely prospect that we know now the Dalai Lama expects to be found as a reincarnation. That means, I think, that China will feel it has to appoint its own person as a 15th Dalai Lama. And now here we get to something very interesting, which is that now China has really a lot of power, a lot of persuasion, a lot of propaganda, and a lot of military hard support for its political claims that it can enforce. But on religious issues, China doesn't really have credibility. It's had long periods when it tried to ban religion. It's now trying to reclassify Tibetan Buddhism as a Sinic, as a Chinese religion. It's limiting what religion practices can happen in Tibet. It doesn't have strong credibility on this religious issue, let alone on the theology of transmigration of consciousness. So here the Dalai Lama is on much stronger grounds. And specifically when he says that an individual decides if he's a Lama where he'll be reborn, he's on much stronger grounds. He's going to have much more support and credibility on that question than the Chinese state. So there's a problem for China there in persuading people that its Dalai Lama will be a genuine reincarnation.
Andy, just quickly, does China fear that this succession issue could go wrong and might threaten to ignite further unrest in Tibet?
I don't think so. So I think Robbie makes a great point here, that we may end up in a situation where there are two people here. Now, but I think what's going to happen, again, just as we see the selection of a pope is also in some ways a political process as well, in that this may be a litmus test for countries around the world. Are they going to recognize the legitimacy, the territorial integrity, the sovereignty of the People's Republic of China in this question of who is the legitimate next Dalai Lama? Or will it be will they choose to recognize one that, is seen as not following the true tradition of how the Dalai Lama is selected? And, it wouldn't be surprising if the U.S. Did not go along with the Chinese choice. But even here, if we look at the Resolve Tibet Act, which passed under the Biden administration, the Trump administration, so far at least, has taken a big step back, I think, to recognize that, this may not be a hill worth dying on. So, I think it'll be a litmus test if it does turn out that there are these two competing Dalai Lamas, if I may put it that way.
Dibesh, what's your thinking on this? If there are two rivals, what will that mean for Buddhists in Tibet and Buddhism in India? And do you share Andy's view that this succession issue won't lead to further strife within Tibet?
In fact, no, I don't agree with the way. It would lead to further strife, and mainly because, of course, if you look at the example of Panchen Lama, another senior Lama, it's very obvious that majority of Tibetans possibly respect the candidate that has been abducted and that's out of the public scene. And there's very little respect for the Panchen Lama that's chosen by Beijing. Now, how do we know? What's a public poll? There is no poll. So imagine what we are having this discussion. None of us are Tibetan people. Try to get a speaker from Lhasa, try to get a speaker from Dharamshala, two Tibetans, and maybe see whether they'd be allowed, especially one from Lhasa, to speak freely or not. And that is the crux of the matter here. The crux of the matter is Tibetans inside Tibet have no say to speak very freely about whether they respect the Dalai Lama's choice or Beijing's choice. So when we have the situation possible of the two Dalai Lama, the risk, of course, is that there'll be heavy investment from Beijing side into its own choice of the Dalai Lama. The way they talk about Taiwan, that one China policy, that everyone has to accept PRC as the real China, not Taiwan. They will try to insist with that. The reality also is that that would lead to more tensions with India, more tensions with US, more tensions with many Western countries. On the ground, it will imply essentially that it will be a recipe for instability for China for many years to come.
Okay.
If the party today has the confidence/arrogance to think it will manage, it won't be able to manage.
All right, just very quickly, Robbie, because we're almost out of time, less than a minute. How badly wrong could this go for both Tibet and Tibetans and for India and China?
The big fear, I think, for China is that there will be an outpouring of mass emotion when the Dalai Lama dies if China has not made a settlement and with him before he dies. And I think we have to remember that everything we're talking about is part of a 70-year-long process, we could say many hundreds of years, of negotiating between Tibet and China about what their relationship was in the past and what it should be now. Was it colonial? Is it now, as Andy says, part of Chinese territory? This relationship is being debated all the time behind the scenes. And the question is, the Tibetans have made many concessions to enable that to move forward. Will China respond at this very, very late stage by offering some concessions to the Dalai Lama before he dies? That's the big question. We have no clues really on that, but that's what we have to wait and see.
Gentlemen, this has been fascinating. We could have talked for much longer, I know, but we're out of time. Many thanks indeed to you all, Robbie Barnett, Andy Mock, and Dibesh Anand. And thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.